So, this chapter, chapter 5, is probably, in my estimation, the most challenging chapter of the course. Because it's most unlike anything else you think we do in cell biology. And in fact, it's more like math and more like chemistry, which are not my most favorite and enjoyable subjects. If you're a good math person and a good chemistry person, you're probably going to love this. But I'm going to try to take it from a biological approach and sort of distance myself from the chemistry and the math as much as I can. But let me preface everything by saying, you will not need a calculator on the next exam. All right? This is not a math class. And like in our other areas, what you do with the final number, how you interpret, what does that mean? That's what I'm concerned about. Understand? So as we begin to talk about bioenergetics, pardon me, and I've got a new prescription coming in, so the cough hopefully will go away. Bioenergetics, the flow of energy in the cell. All energy on this planet comes from one source and one source only, and where is that? The sun. And so when you look at this flow of energy coming from the sun being captured by the autotrophs, and that's cool that it's painted green, because what are the autotrophs? Plants. Then we have the herbivores, and what do herbivores eat? The plants. And then we have the carnivores, and what do carnivores eat? The herbivores that eat the plants that got their energy from. You see how the flow of energy. And so as we look at this at a cellular level, cells require energy for everything. I mean, we've got heat, making things, proteins for instance, new strands of nucleic acids, movement, cells are going to move around. Concentration gradients, charge, separation. It's going to be critical when we get to physiology, especially when we look at nerve signaling and muscle contraction. But once again, all of our energy comes from the sun, and we have organic molecules that we can oxidize or charge, and that's going to be produced by the plants and autotrophs. And then we'll pass these down the lines of the food chains. Decomposers will recycle these, break these down. The plants will pick them back up, and we'll start it all over again. So biological work. This sort of puts a little bit more detail on what we talked about, synthetic. You know, we can look about synthetic work being making new DNA strands, making proteins from nucleic acids. Photosynthesis is a big one for the autotrophs. Mechanical work, our muscles do that. Electrical work, this is going to be important for our nerves in our body. Heat, when you get very, very, very cold, how do you warm your body? Shivering. Do you think, oh, I'm cold, I'm going to shiver to generate more heat? It does it on its own. And interesting, we talked about green fluorescent protein. We can make transgenic animals that will glow. Well, jellyfish do this naturally, and that's bioluminescence, producing photons of light, and it takes energy to do that. So these are some examples of our kinds of biological work. But before we get into the weeds, and I mean, it's going to be the jungle, not just the weeds. This is the jungle. But before we step off into that, we have to have a broader understanding about these systems, energy systems. And they can either be open or closed. An open system is the planet Earth, where we have a continual input of energy from the sun. And energy can escape our planet in the form of heat. Now, when you look at various things that are going on these days, and you talk about global warming and the greenhouse effect, well, these are individuals that are looking at our atmosphere and saying not enough heat is escaping the planet, it's keeping the planet warm. But heat still escapes, so it's an open system. Versus the International Space Station. I think you can envision how that is sort of technically a closed system in the sense you don't want a lot of stuff getting in or out of there. But now that I say that, it's not actually a great analogy because what's providing their electricity? The sun and solar panels. So if you had a time capsule that you buried under the ground, completely sealed up, nothing in, nothing out, that's a closed system. Are living things really going to last a long time in a closed system? If you could set up your own ecosystem where you had some plants that, I don't know, they're not going to get sunlight, so I don't know where they're going to get their energy. So you see how difficult the closed system is to sustain life. So open systems are extremely important. So when we talk about work, we talk about energy, we need to understand two very basic tenets of physics, because work is a part of physics. And if you've had physics, you know how technical this stuff can be. But we're going to simplify it and make it really easy. So we're going to start with two laws. The first being the conservation of energy. This first law of thermodynamics. Somebody summarize the first law for me. Don't make it technical. What's the first law?
Matter can't be created or destroyed, just transferred.
You can't make stuff, you can't destroy stuff. Stuff being matter, matter being a form of energy. So you can't make energy from nothing and you can't destroy energy into nothing. Doesn't work. The only thing you can do with energy is what? Change it. See, just that's as simple as it is. Energy's there. We get it from the sun. All we can do is change it from one form to the next. That's the first law. And a lot of that change is going to happen because of chemical reactions. We're going to build stuff up. Monomers putting together into polymers. And what's our reaction to do that? Monomers to polymers, condensation. We're going to break off monomers from polymers. That's hydrolysis. All of that's going to require energy. Now, I like this as my example. Now, this is different than your notes. I just sort of modified this yesterday afternoon and this morning, and I will upload this new version to D2L. But I like these examples of our first law of thermodynamics. We all know what this is, right? We got a lot of this around East Texas. Trees. Are trees making energy? Are trees making from nothing energy? Can't do it, right? First law. What are our trees doing? Changing. How are the trees changing the energy? First of all, where's the energy coming from for our trees? The sun. How are trees, what are they doing with the energy from the sun? Absorbing the energy. What else are they doing? Yeah, what is that big P process? Photosynthesis, capturing the energy from the sun. And the end product of photosynthesis other than oxygen is glucose. They're capturing the energy and storing it in the chemical bonds of glucose. Now, we all know what this is, right? We cut down the trees, we build a fire. Are we producing, making energy? No. What are we doing? Releasing the stored energy. Where was the energy stored? Where was the energy packaged? By the trees. Where did the energy come from? The sun. It's all going to be that way. We're pretty familiar with this. For us, this is a whole lot easier. We can do this a lot easier than we can capture sunlight and get carbons and put them together into glucose. We're not that good at that, but plants are. This requires the energy input from the sun. Are we going to have to apply energy to this? What's happening to the energy here? I think somebody's already said it. It's being released. And what's our form of energy? I know we got some light. We keep this at night to have some light, but heat is the form of energy. Energy started as a photon of light. It was changed into the chemical bonds. Now we've released the bulk of the energy as heat. You see how we've changed the energy? These are going to be our two types of chemical reactions that we're going to carry through this talk. The taking the energy, the input of energy to build things up. Here, we're going to break things down to release energy. Keep those two analogies in mind, because we're going to take these two things we're pretty familiar with, photosynthesis in plants and combustion from a fire, and we're going to distill that down into chemical formulas. But the concept is going to stay the same. All right? So again, we're starting simple and we're going to get complex as we go. Yeah, we just got complex real quick. Enthalpy. Has anyone ever heard the word enthalpy before? If you've had chemistry, it's probably come up in chemistry. We're more familiar with entropy, which sounds like the same. They're cousins, they're not the same. Enthalpy talks about heat and the difference in our heat energy. Remember our fire we built? If we look, let's go back. If we look at a stack of wood sitting on a fire before we put a match to it versus a fire pit where all the wood has burned down to ash, which would you predict would be able to generate the most heat if you applied fire to it? The pile of wood or the ashes? The pile of wood. So you already conceptually see the difference in the ability to produce heat energy, right? The wood has a greater potential for producing heat energy. The ashes have a much less potential stored in them because that energy's been released already during the process of combustion. Okay? So that change in heat energy we refer to as enthalpy. And we're going to look at the potential of reactants to produce heat versus the products of the reaction and their ability to produce heat. So, in our example, what would the reactants be here? The wood. What are the products? The ash. Okay? You see where we're going? So, if we look at a situation where our reactants, wood, has more energy stored within it and the greater capacity to produce heat than the ashes, which are the products left after a fire, because combustion is a chemical reaction, then we're going to say that the heat energy, the difference between the two, the reactants being second, and you're going to subtract the reactant heat from the product heat. In this case, reactants being higher, products being lower, our delta H, our enthalpy, is going to be less than zero. It's going to be a negative number. Do you see how that works? More ability to make a fire in the wood, much lower ability to make fire in the ashes. That change is going to be negative because the reactant number is bigger. You see how easy that is? It's easy. And so if you look at enthalpy, delta H is another name for enthalpy. And if that number is negative, then you have just described what's going on in a reaction that we used to call exothermic. Now they like to call it exergonic. I don't know why they have to change names. I like thermic better because it talks about heat energy. Exo, exit, what does that sound like? Getting out. This is the release of stored energy. So these reactions release energy. Now, if there was a way, I don't think I can do it, Maybe Harry Potter can. But if you could take reactants, ashes, and somehow have that magic spell that could turn the ashes back into wood. So the reverse of the reaction, right? So our ashes would be the reactants in this case, and we're trying to turn them back into wood. If you could make that happen, do you see how now your reactants have a lower up capacity to produce heat than the wood? And so when we plug, okay, now ashes and wood, we're going to get a number that's greater than 0. And in this case, we're going to have to put some energy into those ashes if they're ever going to burn, if we're ever going to release heat. That kind of reaction is called an endothermic, endo putting in, and what are we putting in is energy. Can you kind of figure out where we're going now? Where are we putting energy into? Where's energy going in? The plants. Photosynthesis. What kind of reaction would photosynthesis be? Endothermic, endergonic. Just remember end going in. X, whether it's exergonic or exothermic, exit getting out. What is our reaction? Endo-X. X. Energy is released. We good? So we basically would say, what is our delta H for photosynthesis? Positive. We're not worried about what the number is, positive, because that describes an end type of reaction. What's our delta H? Negative. X, releasing energy. Okay? All right. So, we've already done this. We just talked about this. Look at this slide. So our example of our X, exit, releasing energy, in addition to combustion here, we're going to look basically at taking a 6-carbon sugar. Can you think of a 6-carbon sugar? Glucose, a hexose sugar. And we're going to have some oxygens around as the electron acceptors at the very end of the process, which is going to release CO2. It's going to release water, but most importantly, what are we releasing from the glucose? Energy in the form of what molecule? ATP. This is aerobic respiration. Glucose, releasing energy, X, exit, energy out. Look at our delta H for this reaction. Negative. X, out. All right? Look at end. We're taking CO2, water, plus energy. Where's the energy coming from? The sun, because we're talking about plants, photosynthesis. Now, we're taking CO2 that's not going to have a lot of energy stored in it. We're packaging it into, there's that 6-carbon molecule again, C6H12O6. Who's that? Glucose. The input of energy means this is in. Change that to endergonic. Say it louder.
The question?
Yes.
Oh, I said, will exergonic always be negative?
Yes. When we're talking about delta H, enthalpy, the answer is yes. X, negative, end, positive. Always. And that's science saying always, but yes, you can put that in the bank. So we're still following our photosynthesis, our trees, the fire with the burning of the wood. But notice, here's our fire, but here's our little fire inside which organelle? Mitochondria, producing energy. Here's our photosynthesis happening. What organelle? Chloroplast. So there's our CO2, water, there's our ATP that we're producing from sunlight, and we're going to make glucose out of it. We make oxygen as well, and we're glad plants do, but that's the biggie. That's where the energy is stored, in the glucose. We're good with X and end. Enthalpy, we're good with enthalpy. Negatives and positives. So again, this is where I sort of put it all together, and again, I'll put this on D2L. But I like this summary slide where we take our examples that we know in the real world, we apply it to what our cells are doing. All eukaryotic cells, plant and algae cells that have chloroplast. Endergonic, end, in. Exergonic, ex, exit. So you know energy in, energy out. That's the big deal. Energy in, energy out. All right, that's first law. What's our first law again? You can't make something from nothing, and you can't take something and turn it into nothing. Doesn't work. Second law. Second law says we're going to be as messy as we can possibly be. Do you know that's a law of physics? Don't go tell your mother when she tells you to clean your room. Say, but Mom, that's just the state of the universe. Entropy. It's supposed to be messy. Is that going to work? No, probably not. So entropy means spontaneity. And really, to me, it's not just spontaneity, it's disorder. Entropy is disorder. Which takes more energy, to keep your room clean or just to let it go wherever? Let it go wherever. Takes less energy. Same for the universe. Molecules want to be as disordered as they possibly can. You understand that's the foundation of diffusion, right? What's diffusion? Molecules moving from high concentration to low concentration. Once molecules have fully diffused so that you have an equal number of molecules on one side versus the other, what happens to movement? Be very careful. That's a trick question. What? Heard speeds up, slows down. Nope. Now, I heard stop. Close. I heard stays the same. Y'all are both very close because ISO, they move the same in and out, so it looks like they stopped. It looks like it's the same. So at equilibrium, when you've got both equal, you got the same movement in either way. So the net movement is what? 0. The net movement is stop. But it's never stopped. It's always moving. So that's this whole idea of disorder, entropy. Because in the universe, we want to be absolutely as disordered as possible. Again, molecules the same way. Less energy required, more energy to keep it like that. So entropy is now delta S, the change in disorder. And we're wanting to be more disordered, which is a higher entropy. More organized, the less favorable condition, is going to be a smaller number. So delta S greater than 0 is disordered. Delta S of 0 is fully ordered. So as we look at this disorder and the fact that we want to be as disordered as possible, here's one to highlight, to take home. All naturally occurring processes are exergonic. X, what does that mean for energy? It's out. Right here. All naturally occurring processes are exergonic, energy out. That increases the disorder. So think about respiration in the mitochondria. Which is more disordered? A 6-carbon glucose molecule or 6 individual carbon dioxide molecules? 6 individual carbon dioxides. They can go wherever. Those 6 carbons are locked into glucose. That's more order going to less order, more disorder, which is what kind of reaction? X or end? X, out. Cellular respiration is exergonic, so it's naturally occurring. So they're exergonic. We're not going to to pay attention to this one just yet. We're getting to it. So just look at that, but don't think about it too long. Exergonic reactions release energy, and they're going to increase their disorder. Naturally occurring reactions. So here's a couple of examples. Now, I see kids in stores or videos of children. I'm talking two-year-olds and up on smartphones. When I was a kid, even elementary school, parents gave us jumping beans. Have you ever seen jumping beans? We've come a long way with technology, right? From jumping beans to smartphones. Jumping beans, how many of you don't know what jumping beans are? Jumping beans are these little plastic things, and there's something inside. They used to say it was a larva. I don't know if that's true or not. But do you know what was in jumping beans? No, I don't know. But they move around, and they actually will jump. So we're going to use jumping beans sort of as to hone our idea of entropy, okay? So we have a container, and we've got 6 jumping beans. And we have a partition right in the middle. Now, I will go ahead and tell you, that partition is low enough that the jumping beans can jump over it. So, what we're looking at, what would be the entropy of that setting right there? Would it be high or low? Low as in 0. That's as ordered as it would be. But we don't want to be there, right? What's going to happen when I let the jumping beans go? What's going to be the prediction of what it's going to look like? They're going to be all over the place. So, if you could take a snapshot after the jumping beans have been allowed to jump, let's say for 10, 15 minutes, and you could take a picture, what is that picture going to look like? Huh? 3 on each side? You said some on each side. Are you good with 3 on each side? 2 on one, 4 on the other? You can't predict it because it's random. But we want to be as disordered as possible. Which is more disordered, 3 and 3 or 2 and 4? Disordered. Okay, now certainly we've got 2 and 4, but you see that's 6 and 0 is the most ordered. And if we get 3 and 3, we're at equilibrium. Equilibrium is going to be the most disordered. So as these things are jumping, what do you notice happening? Most of the time you've got 3 and 3. So we are at equilibrium even though stuff's moving, right? So the net of this is equilibrium 3 and 3. Even though these things don't stop, they just keep going until they die, I guess. Yes, ma'am?
Okay, so is equilibrium always going to be the most disordered?
Yes. Yes. And most disordered is going to mean the lowest energy. That's a good point, in fact. Did you hear that? Write that down. That was good. I need to remember I said that. The most disorder is going to be the lowest energy state. Because again, think of glucose and carbon dioxide. Where can we get the most energy from? 6 carbon dioxides or 1 glucose with 6 carbons? The glucose with 6 carbons. All right? Now what have I done? We've increased this partition, and even though they're still jumping, notice our equilibrium is more difficult to reach, and it's going to take longer to see these 3 and 3 because the jumping beans aren't all jumping at the same height. But they're trying to reach that state of disorder. Okay, let's look at another one. Now what have we done? Uh-oh. Now we got more area on one side than the other. So in this case, if we have favored, if we start over here, we'll say that those are our reactants in a reaction. But now we have all this space over here for our products. What is our most disordered state going to look like? See, when we had it right in the middle, 3 and 3, that was as spread out as the jumping beans could get. What's going to happen here? More are going to be over here because we have more area. So if you look, more often than not, we're going to have 4 over here and 2 over here. So do you understand the concept? Entropy is just disorder. We want to be as disordered as possible. Sometimes our disorder is going to be affected by a barrier in the middle. That might be an enzyme, an enzymatic activity. Another factor is going to be reactants versus products. And we're illustrating that with our area. Now we can also think about adding in enthalpy. You remember enthalpy we said was a change of heat energy? Remember we said wood had all this potential energy stored in it, ashes didn't, it was a lower level. Now look, we're sort of exemplifying that using entropy, our jumping beans, but now it's going to be a lot easier for these beans to get over the wall, so there's more potential energy stored. You're going to have a lot more energy to get up from this side. But our area, notice, is still even. So what's going to happen when we put these beans into motion?
Most of them are probably stayed.
We're going to see a lot of them staying over here, but if they have enough energy, they'll be able to get back. See, instead of having 2 over here a lot, now we're down to 1 at certain points. So do you see how we've changed the equilibrium? We've changed the equilibrium by now affecting enthalpy, the amount of energy needed to get over the wall, and that has an impact on our disorder. We don't have 3 and 3 anymore, simply because we've elevated the size and in that sense changed the energy level. Okay? Now if that doesn't help you, ignore the jumping beans. But we're going to be combining enthalpy and entropy into our chemical reactions just because that's how the universe works. So entropy in the universe wants to increase. We want to be disordered. But unfortunately, entropy is not a great way to analyze, describe, and measure biological processes. So we can't really use entropy. So that's why we combine entropy and enthalpy into a term that we're going to talk about being free energy. And Gibbs free energy is where we get this. So we have this measure. Since entropy is not a great measure, enthalpy is pretty good, but it doesn't take us all the way to where we really need to be, then Gibbs came up with this equation. Now we're going to see that our delta G, our change in free energy, is going to be very similar to our change in enthalpy, the heat energy, but it's not exact because we have to take into account our disorder. So this, scientists want to be as precise as possible, so that's where we said, heat energy is not perfect, let's go to this next step to make it harder on the next test. Now, can you already see and understand that with temperature, that's going to change our disorder? What is a great example of looking at temperature and understanding disorder? Steam. Increase the temperature, what are you doing to the water molecules? More disordered. How can you make the water molecules more disordered? What are you adding? Heat, and that's a form of energy. You're adding energy to the system to disorder heat. But if you lower the temperature enough, you're organizing the water molecules more. Because the water molecules now are cold. And what, in fact, is the definition of cold? What? Absence of heat. So, you're taking the energy away and pushing those molecules closer together, organizing them more. So that's a great example of understanding. As we increase temperature, we're going to increase our entropy, and then we're going to subtract that from our enthalpy, the change in heat. Now, we've already seen with enthalpy, negative enthalpy is at X or end? X, okay? So, if we have an exergonic exothermic reaction with a negative delta H, and we increase the temperature, and again, when we think of our exergonic, we're already going to more disorder. Increasing this with increasing temperature, we're taking away from a negative number. We would predict that this reaction that's already negative 673 is going to get even more negative than it does. But you see, not a lot. It's not going to change a lot. But we're just getting more precise with this measure of free energy. So our rule that we learned for exergonic, endergonic with the negative positive is largely going to also apply to the free energy. All right? So it's not like we're learning something extra. We're just kind of changing the name a little bit because we modified it with this part. We good? We okay? Okay. So as we look at our Gibbs free energy, change in free energy equals the change in enthalpy minus temperature times the change in entropy. We can also compare this number and this equation to our free energy from products and our free energy from reactants, just like enthalpy, right? Products, reactants, it's still the same. If we did it for enthalpy, we can do it for our Gibbs free energy, and we're still going to have the exergonic, endergonic, and that's why that negative positive is still going to apply. Does everybody see that? Okay. Again, we're taking little baby steps as we go through this because this is a big conceptual deal, and it's very different than what we have done before. Now, why do we even care about all this stuff? Well, because you're telling us we have to. No, it's because this free energy is going to tell us if a reaction is feasible. And feasibility refers to thermodynamic, the release of energy versus needing energy to happen. But that delta G is going to tell us if a reaction is feasible, if it can happen, but not that it necessarily will. You have to have very certain conditions for some reactions to be feasible. Others, it's going to be feasible over a broad range of conditions. But this is where our delta G, our change in Gibbs free energy, if it is negative and we have the products and reactants that we need, then in that case, that reaction is going to be favorable and naturally occurring. We're going to expand on that all the way through the rest of this chapter. That's the whole deal. Free energy, negative free energy, is going to mean it's a spontaneous, naturally occurring reaction. If it's negative, it's going to be X. It's going to be X, EX. Negative delta G, a negative change in free energy, is going to be exergonic, exothermic, just like a negative enthalpy is going to be X. Okay? Again, we're building on that initial stuff that we learned. Again, here's some examples. We have glucose. Is glucose organized or disorganized compared to CO2? It's organized. This has a low entropy, but it has a high enthalpy. CO2, more disorganized. This has a high entropy, but it's got a low enthalpy. You're not going to do a lot with CO2. But when we take glucose and we burn glucose, this sounds like aerobic respiration, doesn't it? Well, it is. We get a delta G, a change in free energy, of negative 686. Negative means what type of reaction? X. X. You're releasing energy. That's the thing we're not showing here. You're releasing energy. Here, we're taking CO2 and water, and we're making glucose. What process? Okay, process happening in plants. Photosynthesis. Now, plants also do this with their mitochondria. They do this with their chloroplast. Taking the CO2, putting it together, synthesizing and making glucose, going from disorder to order, needing an input of energy from where? The sun, storing the energy in glucose. Our delta G, our change in free energy, is positive 686. X or end? End. See, you haven't even studied this and you've already got this down. Delta G incorporates entropy and enthalpy. So if we look at our change here, with a delta H being greater than 0, so positive, it's end. Negative, it's X. And if we look at our delta G's happening here, here's our entropy. It's going to be greater than 0, disorganized. It's going to be less than 0, more organized. Then what we're going to see is that, okay, if we have an X reaction, negative delta H, becoming more disorganized, that is going to be spontaneous. It's not going to matter what energy. That's going to go. That's why they did that green. But if we have an end reaction, we're decreasing entropy, so we're wanting to synthesize something. This is non-spontaneous. Spontaneous referring to energy. This is not just going to happen. What's the only way this is going to happen? It requires energy. You have to put energy into this particular reaction. The photosynthesis reaction is not just going to go in the dark. It's going to have an energy input. And that's why the red, stop. That's what non-spontaneous means. It's not just going to happen without the input of energy. Now notice these other two. Here, the delta G, the free energy change, is going to be dependent on the temperature. Likewise here, dependent on the temperature, that Kelvin factor. So, you know I like to simplify stuff, right? Let's just do it like this. Green, spontaneous. When you have a negative, high entropy, spontaneous, it's going to go. Here, you have a positive enthalpy, more organized, not spontaneous, but it will require energy if this is going to happen. On this side, it's spontaneous, but it's got to be hot. Here, spontaneous, but it's got to be cold. You like that? That's how we can wrap our brain around this relationship between enthalpy and entropy and begin to understand how that affects our chemical reactions and thermodynamically and bioenergetically speaking relate to delta G, the change in free energy.